Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand under the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we get into today's show, I do have to plug our Patreon. I know everybody's sick of hearing it at this point, but it is how we keep the lights on. It's how we keep the show going. So if you do want to support us, it's Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. Starts from £3 a month, which works out less than a cup of coffee. You get a bonus episode every single week, which comes in the form of our Q&A episode that we do with our guest after the main show. So if you enjoy a show and you want to hear a little bit more of it, typically there is questions that I've missed, and there's a whole little section where you just get bumper information. The patrons always have some really good questions, and you get the whole back catalog when you sign up. So you don't just get it from when you sign up going forward, you get everything before. So at this point, there are years of bonus material to really get your teeth into. And if you can't support financially, obviously just a like, share, 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast, because then somebody else can find the podcast, and it really does help us kind of bump up those charts. And yeah, well, let's just get into today's show. I'm really excited about it. And so typically we stay within the Viking Age. That's what we normally do. But I had this idea that I want to start stepping out of that a little bit and learning different time periods, different bits of history. I know everybody that listens to this is a huge history nerd, so why not every so often bring somebody on that really knows their stuff about a different time period, and we can all learn together. So today's guest, we're extremely lucky to have Dr. James Dilley. And Dr. James Dilley is a prehistoric technology expert with 20 years of experience making stone and Bronze Age tools. He has worked with TV and media companies all over the world and has had his work displayed in the British Museum and at Stonehenge. So, James, thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
Hello there. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, what did you think when you got a little message saying, do you want to come on the Nordic Mythology podcast?
Immediately, I looked at it and thought, oh, God, it's another one of these blasted spam messages just straight in the junk folder. No. I listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks, but I'm like many crafts people, you're using your hands. And if you're making a lot for stock, it's almost in a methodical, meditative state. So fill in the day with something interesting along the way. So it's like, oh, okay, an interesting podcast for me to add to the selection, and no doubt an interesting podcast for perhaps me to be on. So honestly, I've been on a whole variety of different podcasts before. So this is actually much more closely linked than you would think.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said at the start, it's something I want to do more of. We've done 230 episodes focused on the Viking Age, and there are still things that come up every single week of a topic that we just haven't even looked at. So there's still loads of us to do, but I just love history and I love learning new things. And I know everybody would always love to learn about a new area. So if we can explore those every so often, I think it'll be a lot of fun. And it keeps it fun and keeps it fresh. So as I said to you before this started, I don't really know what classes as prehistory, because I feel like that's just like such a broad term. I just kind of call it as anything old. And I guess like I always think of dinosaurs as being prehistoric. Is that true?
You're a heathen, an absolute heathen.
But there we go. I mean, this is the right podcast for it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, that might not be perhaps more of a compliment to many of the listeners to be called a heathen.
Yeah, that's it.
But I guess prehistory. I mean, I guess as a basic definition is the time before history, before written history. But it gets very complicated around the world because let's say much of Scandinavia, but let's keep it in the podcast home. That a lot of history came into Europe via the Romans, and the Romans didn't really get too far into Germania, and certainly not for too long. And anything beyond that was sort of this uncharted territory that was connected via trade routes, with objects going back and forth. So I guess technically, in Scandinavia, their prehistory is much longer than other parts of Europe. And certainly if you go into the Near East, they have written language in the Neolithic, at the end of the Stone Age. So it's like, is this still prehistory? It starts to get quite tricky to really pin down. But to be honest, prehistory, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, as terms, they're quite archaic. It sort of relies on the fact that in this time, they used stone predominantly. And in this new time period, metal came in the form of bronze. And in this time period, iron came along. But actually, stone continued in the Iron Age and bronze continued into the Iron Age. So and sometimes you get some of those earlier materials that sneak across into the time period beforehand. So it starts to get pretty difficult to actually pin down. There are no hard lines, unfortunately, in prehistory, and no convenient trends to fit things nicely. I mean, humans don't fit into boxes very easily, and that has been the case over thousands of years, fortunately and unfortunately.
Wonderful. So it's complicated, which is our kind of official tagline at this point on the podcast, because everything is, and that's the one thing I learned so fast doing this podcast, because I came from just a lay person who happened to get really lucky and has now had the chance to speak to some really amazing people. But I always just assumed we knew everything, not everything about history, but like a lot, and everything was pretty defined, because my education was like GCSE level. I did medieval history at A level, but that was about it. And I kind of had this idea of, you had these time periods and that was set. Like the Viking Age was like this year to this year, and it was just, that's what it is. The Iron Age is this to this. But I've quickly learned that it's a complicated world out there.
Yeah, very much so. And the thing is with archaeology is that it's constantly changing as well. That with new discoveries or new interpretations, it's like, okay, well, this is the current interpretation, but that may well change, either with a new fashion to look at things in a different way, or just find new discoveries, and sometimes reinterpretations of new discoveries that are quite secondary, and then it gets very, very complicated. So I guess even my relationship with prehistory is complicated in that way. It, as someone has said in the comments rather, we are complicated animals, and it's very, very true. We are very complex people. And I guess to try and outline, let's stick to Britain. That's where we're both sitting now. Let's look at the British timeline briefly. And the first people currently that we know of, although it may get pushed back, the earliest people arrived in Britain around about 900 to 950,000 years ago. So pretty much knocking on the door of 1 million years ago, right at the start of the Stone Age, in a period called the Paleolithic, old Paleolithic stone, from the Greek for lithos, or lithics, stone tools. So old stone tools. And that continues right through to the Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, which starts around about, depending on where you are and what you're inclined towards, let's say somewhere around 12,000 years ago, or slightly less. So nearly 1 million years ago, all the way through to about 11,000 years ago. And we've still got 2 time periods of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the migration period, and we're a tiny little blip just on the end of that. And the area that I cover is the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, and through to the Bronze Age. So I guess on a representative timeline, that's about 99.8% of that human timeline representatively. So to travel through and grasp all of those different massive environmental, climatic, cultural changes, it's across time and through worlds that you get to explore, or dauntingly get to explore. It's not necessarily a pleasure all the time.
Wonderful. Okay, I have two questions. First, is the oldest man skeleton still the one in Cheddar Gorge, or have I misremembered that?
Uh, the oldest complete human remains could be Cheddar Man. But the oldest human remains in Britain are currently from Boxgrove, which is actually almost a stone's throw from where I'm sitting now. I could
Wow.
walk to the site in about 2 minutes, and just chance, from a site that dates to 500,000 years ago. But all that was found was a tibia and 2 teeth. And we're not certain what human that would have been. And I sort of say it in a very static, sterile term. We're not sure which human it would have been, and that sort of makes it very devoid of the personality of that person, who I'm sure had a huge amount of personality and was very complex, as we've already identified. But with those particular elements, it's very difficult to pick out whether it would have been a subgroup of Homo erectus or perhaps someone from the group Homo heidelbergensis. But the key thing is they're all part of that genus Homo. They're all humans, just like us. So they're most definitely human. And I guess that's that connection through time, is that although it might be hundreds of thousands of years ago, they were still human, and they had so many traits that are similar to us. They got as excited as we might be when we make something successfully, just as annoyed when we break something or something doesn't go our way, and they could be just as lazy as we can. They were not perfect, and that's the thing you've got to remember, that it might be a vast amount of time ago, seemingly worlds away, but they were absolutely human as we are.
This is such a nerdy reference, but right now my brain is like the little sacred timeline in Loki, where it's just breaking off into like a million different questions, and I'm just trying to figure out which one I want to go down. You said that the skeleton was 500,000 years ago, but did you say that the first people were a million years ago? So how would we know?
Yeah, this is where it does get complicated, because the first evidence of people in Britain comes from nearly 1,000,000 years ago, from where I'm from where I'm living now in North Norfolk. But the first actual human remains that we have identified and dated come from near where I am now in Chichester. The reason we know about those earliest pieces of human evidence from the North Norfolk coast from nearly 1,000,000 years ago is from geological dating from the layers that those stone tools were found in. And from the site of Boxgrove, which is so nearby to where I am now, from the lower Paleolithic, so the old end of the Stone Age. It was a site where a group of humans came down to collect flint, to make axes, to butcher animals, and it was a tidal zone that would quickly get covered by sediment. So someone had died at some point, and whether they had been carefully placed in a position or whether they had just been left to the open, but their remains had been moved about a little bit. So that's why we only had that tibia and 2 teeth. It's only much, much later. In fact, for that Cheddar Man that you mentioned, he's closer to today than he is to that person that was found just down the road at Boxgrove by many, many multiples. And yet they were both living in what we call the Paleolithic. That's how extreme this time period gets, is that, as I said, we're so much closer to Cheddar Man, who looked very different to us and lived in a very, very different landscape to what would become Britain. And yet he's at one end of the Paleolithic, and the person from Boxgrove was not even at the very start, sort of halfway along, but they are just so disconnected in time. And we as archaeologists have to try and put those handful of pieces back together. And I always try to think of archaeology, and particularly prehistory, as this really stunning picture of culture, beliefs, stories, language, vibrancy in a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. And over 5,000 years, 50,000 years, maybe even 500,000 years, you will lose 995 of those pieces in that jigsaw puzzle. And the 5 pieces you have left is all that you have to try and reconstruct that picture as archaeologists. And I can guarantee you they won't be corner or even edge pieces to at least start you off.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't give us much to work with. So we have to do an awful lot in interpretation. And through things like analysis or even experimental archaeology, you can bring back one or two of those pieces, but really not very many. There's so little that we know about this time period and these people.
Do you have a struggle then when talking about this time period of trying to disconnect people from seeing them in their own image? Because I guess when we talk about Vikings, it's 1,000 years ago. They're going to look like we look. But I'm assuming somebody 500,000 years ago, and if we can get into that maybe just briefly of what would classify as a human. I know you're probably not used to talking on this simpler terms anymore. You're probably way past this. But for I guess our listeners and particularly me, it's just not a time period that I've ever really looked into. I've kind of learned about it in passing. So I'd love to just like that classification of what classes of human and these earlier skeletons, how much they would look like me, I guess.
Yeah, and it gets very difficult to pin down exactly what they would have looked like because we rely an awful lot on having the skull because that gives us a sense of face, what they would have looked like. And even then you can reconstruct to a forensic level what their face might have been like to give us a chance to make eye contact with that person, that most important part. And as I'm looking at you now, even through the screen, we're not in the same place, but me being able to see your face gives me that opportunity to connect with you. But without those components that give us half a chance to do that, that already starts to make it quite difficult. But even if we do have a perfectly preserved skull from 500,000 years ago, we don't often know exactly what their skin color might have been, their hair color, their eye color, because that relies on how well preserved their DNA is that might be able to be extracted from the bones if they're well preserved. And if they're not well preserved, then we might never know. They would perhaps cut a humanoid figure, but I guess on quite a soft focus, we can recognize it's a human from a distance. But what they might have looked like in higher definition starts to become, or I guess remain, rather fuzzy without new analysis or new finds even that help bolster that picture. So what makes us human, I suppose, is a big question. How do you unpackage that? Yeah, you're a rascal you are, Dan, for giving me a question like that right at the start as well after a busy day. What makes us human? Well, I mean, I guess just from quite a sterile definition, our genus makes us human to categorize us into that human. But looking outside the box, what are those characters, those traits that make us human? Is it our ability to hunt, be innovative, do certain things or interact, have complex language or culture, and who defines that? That's the question. And I struggle. I mean, I couldn't easily sit down and say, oh yes, this person is human. They come from this part of our incredibly complex evolutionary tree. They are definitely human. But this person that lived at this time, not so much. How do you say that? Because although we have our genus Homo, prior to the genus Homo, we had, you might have heard of the skeleton Lucy that was found in Central Africa, one of our earliest, most distant ancestors. And she was part of the genus Australopithecus. But does that make her any less human? She walked on two legs, was humanoid. How do you break that down to what is or isn't a human? It starts to get very difficult. But I guess from a point of interest, we almost all want to know where we come from, and being able to give a solid answer to that question of what makes us human, where do we all come from, both gets very complicated and protracted protracted rather quite quickly, because how can I give you those exact answers to say, aha, well, as soon as we started making stone tools of this style, not that style, but this style, and started making fire, for example, or hunting rather than scavenging, that makes us human. But you could equally argue, but people who are intelligent enough to wait for the heavy predators to move on so that they could scavenge and use fairly complex stone tools to cut away at the carcass, break the bones to get at the marrow, that really nutritious substance that helps for all its fatty goodness. That clearly makes someone human because they were intelligent enough to recognize that. It gets incredibly complicated very quickly. And that is the basis for a lot of Paleolithic archaeological discussion and argument, is how do you pin that down with such scanty evidence, as I already pointed out. So I guess looking at that timeline, we've looked at the lower Paleolithic, when our picture of humans is very distant and very soft focused. And you have some of those groups that may or may not have been in Britain, those subgroups of Homo erectus, like Homo heidelbergensis or Homo antecessor. And then we start to get a more recognizable character, Neanderthal cousins, which I guess from a mixture of Hollywood and tabloid newspapers, to call someone a Neanderthal might be seen as a bit of an insult, and jokingly, unless you're from sub-Saharan Africa originally, most of us will carry a small amount of Neanderthal DNA within us that has been passed down over many generations. And on certain high streets of a Saturday night, I'm not afraid to say you might see a little more than 2%.
Absolutely. So do they class as humans? And they had Neanderthals?
Most definitely. I guess, and anything from the earliest Homo ergaster, so Homo erectus, heidelbergensis, even not very PC to say, but the hobbits, as sometimes called, the skeleton that was found on Flores Island in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, the small humanoid, it's human within the genus Homo. Again, it does get very, very complicated, as I say. Imagine that tree with all of those many branches, some split off from others, some come together in a tributary. So what starts and ends that line of humans? Well, I guess we're carrying it on. But what ended the Australopithecine? What did they become? When did they die out? When you've got enough skeletal remains from those humans to fit in maybe one or two shoe boxes, how can you possibly start and end their story with any kind of confidence without huge amounts more material? At the moment, we can look at that very distant time through a very, very opaque lens that we can't really say for certain, or with any kind of confidence, how those people lived, for example, but how they fitted solidly into that timeline, when they appeared, when they disappeared. And that's where we struggle a little, but where some genetic science can be brought in to perhaps identify missing links, as it were, to say, aha, there must be a missing human here. We might not have found the bones yet, but looking at our genetic sequence today, there are the archaic pieces to the puzzle that show there must be a human out there somewhere that's just waiting to be found. And I guess that is that exciting school child excitement that there are these treasures to be found out. It might not be shiny pieces of gold, but in fragile bits of bone that actually could unlock the human story a little bit more. But it isn't just one door that unlocks the complete picture. It is many doors that require many keys, and they all need to be found, and sometimes in the right order, to make things easier to look through.
Do you think we will ever find them?
No.
Or find them all?
No. Unfortunately, it's that jigsaw puzzle I mentioned. Unfortunately, it's one that's been bought from a charity shop, and it's got some puzzle pieces from other jigsaw puzzles, and some child in the past has accidentally lost some of them, the most important
Might have
pieces. So
eaten it.
unfortunately, we will never find them all. And it's only generally in absolutely exceptional circumstances, chance circumstances, that we actually find some of those human remains. So, and there can only be so many chance circumstances. A vast amount of those people and what remains of them will be lost forever, unfortunately.
So is a Neanderthal part of the Homo gentis? What?
Yeah, very much
Okay.
so.
So how come it doesn't have the the little Homo prefix?
They are the Homo neanderthalensis.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's always thrown me a little bit as to why it wasn't on there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess perhaps 20, 30 years ago, you had names like Nutcracker Man or Handyman for Homo erectus, because they made things like complex stone tools, or Neanderthals, and then modern humans, us, the noble savage, as it were, for very archaic terms. But I guess quite scientifically, as the hard-nosed academic, should call them Homo neanderthalensis. But
I've never heard that before.
yeah, it's not used particularly widely. It's curious, but I guess it's a quirk of archaeology that it's not used particularly. But they're very much human. They're very, very similar to us. But really, they would be very complex. They would most definitely have quite complicated language, almost definitely vocabulary. To have lived on this earth longer than we have, and to live through much more challenging climatic settings, to be able to hunt some of the really tough prey, or to hunt some of the really tough predators that they were able to bring down, involved complex planning, effective stone tools, a whole variety of tactics, you name it, that later early modern humans shied away from, perhaps going for the easier target in the likes of reindeer rather than woolly rhino or mammoth. So does that make them better humans? Neanderthals certainly had bigger brains than we do now on a capacity point of view. We have smaller brains. And in fact, our human brains appear to be shrinking over time. That doesn't mean their surface area is shrinking, because no one wants a smooth brain. It has limited surface area. Our brains are shrinking, but they're getting crinklier. So Neanderthals had a larger cranial capacity. So they would have been very effective hunters. Their spatial awareness would have been excellent, because they had very wide heads. The parts of their brain that would have allowed them to hunt and see things very quickly and react would have been excellent, and they would have been fantastic sprinters. We, as modern humans, were more gracile. We were thinner, longer, taller. We could run for greater distances, but we didn't have that power, that surging force that Neanderthals did. They were, as Clive Gamble, a Paleolithic archaeologist, pointed out, the brain is an expensive tissue. It requires a huge amount of calories and energies to run, and the bigger the brain, the more calories you need. And Neanderthals had great muscle mass as well, which in itself needs huge amounts of energy to run. So Neanderthals, I guess if you're playing on your game of some kind and you're maxing out on all the attributes, but then realize that for all of that energy and power to run this main character that you've got doesn't quite meet the requirements, then you're either going to need to find more energy in the form of food, or you die. We run out of that energy, and that may have been part of the reason that Neanderthals' demise. That their brains were larger, they had bigger muscle mass, they were very effective people. But while we are not necessarily more powerful, we're not necessarily faster, we're more efficient, perhaps.
Okay, my brain froze then for a second. So okay, did we live at the same time?
Yes.
Us and Neanderthals. I guess, yeah, the question you kind of touched on it then is, why would they have died out, I guess, versus us, which I guess you touched on that, because they sound quite superior in many ways. Yeah, let's go with that first, if there's any more to be said on that, or is that pretty much it? That maybe it was just that
there's a whole variety of factors that might have affected the demise of Neanderthals. The appearance of us was almost certainly a factor in that. And I say us, but that's quite loaded because we will have almost no connection to those earliest hunter-gatherers. They were one of those branches in that tree that died out. We'll have no connection to them whatsoever. So if you've
how long ago? Sorry, how long ago were we talking at the earliest Homo erectus?
So for the earliest, I guess the earliest Homo sapiens, they appeared
Homo sapien. I can't even get that right. What's Homo erectus?
Yeah. let's get all the numbers out.
Let me get it.
Work it when they all appeared and disappeared.
What's a Homo? Is Homo erectus anything that stood upright?
Yes.
Okay. See, this is how basic we have to go right now.
Yeah. So Homo erectus, we're talking millions of years ago. For Neanderthals, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years ago. For us as Homo sapiens, we're talking hundreds to tens of thousands of years ago. And obviously we're still here. But while Neanderthals might have appeared sometime around 400,000 years ago, they disappeared around 40,000 years ago. But while we as modern humans, very much a we, appeared sometime around 200,000 years ago up to today, we have lived on the earth the shortest amount of time.
Why do you think? Because again, for me, somebody who's not in this world, I guess I always have a somewhat negative look at Neanderthals. Like I feel like that's just been bred into me at some point in my life, that it's almost us and this other quite simple, and they're always maybe portrayed as quite simple and quite, I guess, brutish, but not, but like another to us. I think that's why I always thought maybe that they weren't even classed as human, which is quite sad, really. That I'm sure if I have that thought, I'm sure there's so many other people listening to this that will have had that same opinion put on them at some point in their life. And why do you think that is?
Hollywood, simply. Hollywood, and a time when looking at other cultures around the world, through I guess a time period and the lens of empire, had a huge amount of racism behind it, to look at cultures around the world and suggest that they're somehow primitive or savage. Nothing like the Victorian England, for example, would be the way to categorize those people. They can't be in any way related to the English gentleman, but that's very much of the time, and sort of very early Hollywood films of early savages, of Neanderthals, when at the same time you had these early archaeologists who were discovering the skeletal remains of the likes of Neanderthal. They hadn't had the chance, I suppose, to actually think about and piece together how complex these people might be. They lacked the scientific processes that we have today, but they were pioneers that within a time that saw often anyone other than our immediate selves as modern people, particularly as white people in academia, or those early antiquarians, anything other than that, well, they are far more primitive. Surely any sort of suggestion that they were in any way complex or even anything close to human would be frowned upon, surely. But and that's taken a huge amount of time to deconstruct all of that, and poor rhetoric that we look at today and you think, oh God, people really thought things like that. And particularly for Neanderthals, looking at them as quite brutish, it hangs on. It really does cling on today, and it's not helped even today by the likes of Hollywood and films and other media that, as I said earlier, that to suggest someone is quite Neanderthal it is considered an insult. But that they were really brilliant people. But we know so little about them at the same time. They were some of the first artists. They started to work in other materials. They lived in particularly challenging parts of the world, but they clearly had, or were able to have, a connection with with modern humans, and were able to see some of the processes and skills that they were employing and actually use them for themselves. How they died out, I would imagine it was a combination of things that happened around the same time, which really didn't help their plight, either from climate change, us, perhaps environmental disasters. There were a couple of major volcanic eruptions around that 60, 50,000 years ago. The disappearance of their main prey animal that meant they might have had to have changed hunting strategy, that they might not have had the skills. I suppose, again, that feels a bit unkind, but perhaps the adaptability to be able to work in an environment that previously they would have moved out of to follow prey, but if that prey doesn't exist, or that area that they were hoping to move into is now occupied by new people, what do you do? How does that fit into your seasonal cycle? And that's very much conjecture. I'm trying to piece together, based on some logic, what might have happened. I'm selling you a story that might not have been the case at all. We're just trying to offer interpretation and options. But let's leave the Paleolithic for a bit, because it does get wild and open, and where do you stop? We could have multiple chats just on that time period, for perhaps something in the future.
I was just about to say, I'm watching my little clock fly by, and I don't want to rush over like your specific work and the experimental archaeology and the craft that you do. So I don't know if you would be willing to come back in maybe in a few weeks, or whenever you can fit it in your schedule. We could just focus on this being like an overview episode of what on earth prehistory is, and then we can then spend a good amount of time on yours, because I have so many questions that I still want to ask, and I don't want I don't want to kind of go, oh, by the way, please tell me about your craft for 10 minutes, or we could just sit here for hours and hours. I mean, if you're up for that, I'd be more than happy to.
Yeah, well, I'm a chatty person. If I've got a beer next to me, as we're both enjoying now. Cheers.
Exactly. Cheers. Thank you.
It's like-minded people. You just go for it.
I'm so inquisitive as well that I just want to keep going with things. So yeah, let's try and split. We'll split it up, and we'll do another one whenever you get a chance in the future, and we'll talk just on that. Because I quickly want to just throw it back to, we were talking about what makes us human. And I remember watching a documentary on Netflix, and I'm sure you will have seen it, and you'll be able to remember the details so much better than me. And it was about a group of, I'm guessing Homo something or other, that carried their dead through a cave to like a little what seemed like a little ritual burial area. And I remember watching it, and I was completely blown away by this idea that something so old, and I guess I would class it like primitive, was so respectful and made this what seemed like a really tough journey to then take their dead somewhere that seemed to be some sort of ritual space.
Yeah, so you were watching the documentary about the Neanderthals that lived in Shanidar Cave in Iraq, that from hundreds of thousands of years ago stayed rather than tens of thousands. And actually, you would have seen some of my stone tools and other tools in the documentary, or any of those spears and other tools were mine.
We'll pretend I did that on purpose.
Yes, yeah. Let me just get the plug in quite quickly. Yes. Shanidar is a very interesting site, that it has the remains of Neanderthals from quite a wide period of time, but it appears to have been reused as a site of burial, and intentional burial, to dig a pit or a grave to carefully place the remains in. It is something we rarely get prior to Homo sapiens, and that's not uniform. We don't see Neanderthal burials or solid evidence of Neanderthal burials elsewhere around the world. It appears to only be this cave. Why were they only doing it here? Could it be lack of evidence elsewhere? Could it be that for some reason they feel a need, either spiritually, culturally, or from a practical point of view, to put the remains underground because they want to use the cave for something else, and it's a bit smelly to leave those remains around? It does start to get quite tricky. the key thing about that makes Shanidar special, or did for many years, was the famous flower burial, the intentional placement of flowers in one of the graves. But even that is hotly debated because it seems quite clear that a lot of those pollen grains got into this particular grave via burrows from animals in the cave floor that either were bringing in the remains of flowers themselves, or they just blew into the cave. And that's where you have to be quite careful with situations like that, not to jump to exciting conclusions too quickly. And I think in the documentary, they tried to sort of, I guess, resell that story, but it's very sketchy, unfortunately. I mean, it's pretty amazing that Neanderthals appear to have been burying the dead as a headline in itself, let alone just placing flowers in graves. I mean, it'd be amazing if they did do something like that, but we need more uniform evidence. One outlier that might have been affected by animals burrowing into the pit because nice soft sediment and, you know, there's perhaps something tasty underneath, is not solid or uniform enough evidence to really say, aha, Neanderthals were complex and had burial practice based on this one example. It's not good science, and it's not solid enough for us to really make broad statements. But we certainly know those Neanderthals that lived a couple of 100,000 years ago were incredibly complex people. They made very effective stone tools. And as I said, they were able to hunt in difficult settings. So just to do that alone, it involves a lot of the grey matter to do that. That I suppose the difference in us, and I suppose that's where the archaic difference was viewed, is that we had art that we can see today. And that's perhaps the important bit. We can see that art today. Neanderthals may have had all sorts of art that is not preserved in the record, unfortunately. We do have little tiny pieces of art that's quite abstract and quite basic, but they might have been able to show artistic expression in a whole variety of other ways that is not preserved in the record. So it's not good to say that Neanderthals were simple or basic because they were not capable of that artistic expression. We just don't have the evidence yet to say for sure either way that they did or they didn't.
I feel like at the end of the documentary, was there an argument of some markings in the cave being argued to be art? I don't know. You obviously know more than me how it felt like a little bit of an add-on to the end.
Yeah, and there are a couple of caves around Europe where there appear to be quite abstract markings or ochre, that reddish pigment from natural iron rust on cave walls that appear to, based on the uranium in the calcium coating in the cave that's on top of the artwork, appears to be, based on the date, to have been done by Neanderthals. But is it art? Is it perhaps a child just finding a coloured rock and just dotting it on the wall, or just sharpening a tool in some way by creating scratch marks that we see as potential artwork, but it was just someone sharpening something? Who knows? That's where things start to get tricky. But the more we find, now that starts to bring in more evidence to suggest, actually, this might be artwork. We're finding more and more of it. It isn't just a one-off. And that's where, with that extra evidence to plead the case for Neanderthals being artistic and showing all that self-expression, it starts to become a much stronger case.
How do we qualify what classes as art? Because I've been around some galleries and I look at some of it and I'm like, I'm not really sure that's art to me. So where do we make that kind of distinction? And also, I think you touched on it. Is it possible there maybe their art forms are just something that we don't recognize as art now, or maybe singing was their thing, or music, which we just would never. You can't tell that now, can you?
You're bringing out all the tricky questions tonight. What makes us human, and what is art?
What is art?
Yeah. Oh, dreadful. Get all the tricky questions out now. Goodness, what is art? Blimey. I guess art is
or
how
if there
you
was
interpret it.
I was wondering if in like an academic sense of when you look at, because at what point do you just look at a mark, like 3 lines scratched into a cave wall and say, oh, that's now an artistic piece versus, I guess, would counting even be, again, would counting even be a thing? Did they count? Did they mark things to count?
We don't know. We don't know. That's the problem. It's lack of uniformity. But does art have to be uniform?
No, absolutely not.
That's the problem we have, and that's why I guess right from the outset, particularly for that Paleolithic, and then I mean, I went to the University of Southampton where they're very Paleolithic focused. They love the Paleolithic there, but my I guess where my heart sits is very much with the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Don't tell them at Southampton that, but that's very much where my heart is, because you get the lovely polished stone axes and bronze work. Oh, they're very nice. Hence why I'm desperately trying to move on from the Paleolithic, because it's very old and exciting. There's always different humans running around, but it's so distant, and it does start to get into some very, very tricky questions of what is art?
What is art?
What makes it human? Yeah, thanks, Dan. What is art?
Okay, let's come forward then. Let's come to the Bronze Age. You said.
I guess in the build up to this, I was thinking, what connections can we make to what the podcast normally looks at, and that I guess for the closest time period to what the podcast perhaps normally talks about is perhaps the Iron Age and into the Viking period, and of course the Bronze Age fits in quite snugly before the Iron Age, and actually I suppose a lot of even artwork or stories, belief, culture in the Viking world has its origins very much in the Bronze Age. And in fact, some of the best Bronze Age rock art is in some of the heartland of Scandinavia, in places like Sweden, in Tanum, where you have these stunning petroglyphs of people on boats carrying axes and spears, almost definitely crossing the sea to perhaps raid another group or trade with another group. And I hope, had I have not introduced that as Bronze Age rock art, picturing perhaps a Viking raid across the North Sea, but actually that very much has its roots in the Bronze Age, almost definitely. And if anyone has been to the stunning National Museum in Copenhagen, you will see, for a country that doesn't have any copper, tin or gold reserves, the most stunning amount of Bronze Age metalwork and wealth on show. Where did all of that material come from, either as finished or raw goods? Was it traded? Was it raided? Who knows? It's quite hard to say for certain, but these were clearly people who had connections to the wider world, despite it being at the time a seemingly cold and dark country. But actually, no, not at all, or region rather than country. They were very much connected to the wider world, much like the world of the Vikings, who had connections to the Arab world, for example, and perhaps even further afield. And the same was the case in the Bronze Age too. Our famous site, I suppose, in Britain at the moment, from the end of the Bronze Age, is Must Farm, near the village of Whittlesea or close to Peterborough. It comes from around about 850 BC, so a bit before the Iron Age. But it's a site, a settlement that was built on stilts with a palisade enclosure around it in the fen, that was found during quarrying. And for the 5 roundhouses that were found, they at some point were built, of course, and then within a year, the whole settlement caught fire, and their turf roofs acted like coffee plungers that pushed everything into the watery, dark, muddy fen below. And that meant that, unusually for archaeologists, for Cambridge Archaeological Unit who excavated it, they had all of the objects from daily life that were left in their life position, because usually for archaeologists, they might find a few pits in the ground filled with broken pots, because people have taken all of their valuable things and moved on. We're just left with a small trace, those 5 bits of the 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. But at Must Farm, because everything was found, just minus the people who escaped, We've got many more than 5 pieces of the puzzle. We've got bronze axes still in their handle, clay pots still with their dinner in with a wooden spoon poking out of one where it's just dropped into the water. We have fragments of cloth, bobbins with thread on them, with the linen thread 0.2 of a mil thickness, really fine cloth that they were producing on site. And amazingly, glass beads that have been made in Iran from 3,000 years ago. So the idea of people being connected 1,000 years ago across the old world is not new. You can go back to 3,000 years ago and they were connected to a much, much wider world. They were pioneers of travel back then too. We just have the sagas and stories, often from Saxon monks that were being chased around the likes of Lindisfarne, to give us some of those stories. Whereas in the Bronze Age, in Europe, we're limited to the likes of the Iliad to give us the story of the siege of Troy, or Jason and his Argonauts that are from the Middle Bronze Age, or the siege of Troy from the end of the Bronze Age, to give us glimpses of what life might have been like in a poem from the other side of Europe. But there were almost certainly those complex stories in the Bronze Age too, those heroes that were revered and immortalized in stories over 3,000 years, the equivalent of a Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, who lived several thousand years earlier and used bronze rather than iron swords, and traveled across much of Europe. That they almost certainly existed. We just don't have their names and exact stories. But we even have major battles in Europe in the Bronze Age. We have the rarest of archaeology, battlefield archaeology from Germany, where around 5,000 people fought over a causeway. What were they fighting over? We don't know, unfortunately, but they were using clubs, spears, arrows, some tipped with flint, some with bronze, swords. People fought from horseback. We have a huge wealth of archaeology from that one site, but it just lacks that written record to I guess, contextualize it all, unfortunately.
Do we get much, if any, written record? Because obviously we're talking about a time period, as you defined early on, it's before writing. But do you get any of this maybe carried on through oral tradition until there's writing? And if you do, how can you accurately pull that back and strip apart what would be made up, what would not be? And it must be so incredibly difficult to study a time period before anything was written down. You must rely so heavily on archaeology, but obviously archaeology only gives you quite a linear
perhaps fragments of those stories and culture. And a famous one that often gets brought up, but I guess quite topical for today, or I've been doing a bronze sword casting workshop, is what are the origins of the sword in the stone? Because you certainly don't make an iron or steel sword in a stone, but you do make a bronze sword in a stone mold. So are there origins there from the Bronze Age? Who knows? Are there any other connections or stories or ideas that come from such a distant time period? Who knows? But I guess we can look back now and think, well, do we have fragments from 1,000 years ago? Do we have fragments within our culture from 2 or even 3,000 years ago? Absolutely. We see components of prehistory in much of our daily life, our culture, that might be hidden behind a few layers, but it's very much there. And of course, today we're trying to pull it back to rebuild that connection, rebuild our bridges back to that distant time period. And you can even perhaps listen to music that's been inspired by components of prehistory. I mean, you think of the likes of Heilung, that for some of their songs that they have music based on percussion or lures that are very much Bronze Age horns, or even the styles of some of the headdresses that are based on things from the Middle Stone Age, let alone the Bronze Age. We have components of that culture today. So it's an almost certainty that people in the Iron Age or the Viking periods had components of their culture just from the Bronze Age. And here's a real one for next time you're in your supermarket, look at a packet of Lurpak butter. You'll see two horns on it that cross. They're lures, they're Bronze Age horns, and Lurpak's Danish butter. But if you go across to Denmark, to many of their museums, they will have these very distinctive Bronze Age horns. So we have pieces of that time, that distant time in much of today's society.
Is that the two really famous horns? Or were they gold? Why am I thinking of two gold horns?
Not sure the gold horns come, but they're very much Bronze Age.
Maybe I'm thinking of the bronze ones. I just remember I've seen two. Are they got little figures all the way around them? Were they lost? But we have replicas of them. Am I right in thinking that?
We have them, very much so. We have
maybe
them.
I'm thinking of some different
case
ones
in the National Museums that have, it's just full of horns all interweaving each other. They're stunning, but I've got a funny feeling there's a big old sculpture or a statue of two horns in that sort of configuration that might perhaps be part of that story as well.
I was just trying to, but for the first time ever, use my little second screen over here and pull them up so I could look at them, because I'm sure there's some gold ones, but maybe I'm just getting confused, which would not be the first time on here. It happens quite often. So you said they were bronze horns?
Yes.
I was going to see if they were the ones that I was thinking of. The lures. Oh, okay. Yeah, I know the ones you mean. They're not what I was thinking of. I was thinking of the golden horns of Galahus, which I'll have to have a look at what. So I was thinking of those. But yeah, wonderful. I'll take a little look at them after we've finished.
Yeah, it's all around you. Bits of prehistory.
Yeah, I guess it does pop up everywhere. Where were we? We were are we in the Bronze Age now?
We were in the Bronze Age, yeah. We're very much going on a whistle-stop tour of prehistory.
We are. Is the anthropomorphic sword, is that a bronze? That's the one that I feel like the little, is that a bronze sword with the little human figure?
Iron Age, I think, is the one you're thinking of.
Okay. I've just, because going back to the kind of what makes us human topic, for me, it would always be something that's when you start seeing belief systems come in. So I think that's why I brought up the caves with the burial. That's a very human trait for me. Whereas because a lot of animals hunt, some animals hunt with tools. But I think when you have that respect for dead or rituals and faith, that feels like a very human thing. And I was wondering whether we find that in any prehistoric burial sites. Obviously, we have the famous ship burials from the Viking Age that have very lavish items that have been left, and clearly they have such expense and such use in the time, but they're willing to leave them there because obviously the respect to leave them is worth more than keeping them. And I wonder whether do we get that in a prehistoric setting where
very much so, yes, and certainly with humans as Homo sapiens, some of the earliest Homo sapiens are leaving very rich graves and leaving fairly strong candidates in objects like Venus figures that suggest, well, that could be some kind of idol or some kind of religious object. Prior to Homo sapiens, it starts to get quite sketchy and scanty, and that's where there is a high chance of having some kind of belief system, but how do we clearly define it based on the evidence? And that's unfortunately where it starts to get quite hard. And I'm not someone because you'll often hear from people say, oh, the ancestors were very, very clever, and they could build all sorts of things, and when you go too far and you're off into pseudo archaeology of they could levitate things and all the rest of it, and advanced civilizations, etc., with no evidence, or certainly no peer-reviewed evidence, importantly. But I'm not someone who likes to give too much credit without evidence, because to be truly scientific, we need to actually sort of say, oh, yes, well, this could be this, it could be this. If there's more evidence, then perhaps it will give more weight to this argument. And as I suggested earlier, for those Neanderthals prior to Homo sapiens, we just don't have enough of that uniform evidence to give enough in the form of religious ritual religion prior to Homo sapiens at the moment. There's little bits and pieces. There's examples of cave bear skulls that have a bone put through the side of the jaw, not broken, but just tucked in so it sort of sits in place. Is that a religious act? Could that mean something? Or possibly. Could it mean don't come in the cave for some reason? Interpret that as you like. But it's hard to say, unfortunately. Without that consistency that we get later in time, we can't say for certain. But it's certainly a good point. What makes us human? The appearance of perhaps religion and culture. But even let's look far forward into the Bronze Age, when grave goods in Britain start to become quite rare in the late Bronze Age, because people are cremating their dead and we get very few graves. Does that mean they were not complex or had religious practice or culture? Well, clearly not. But if they're burning all the evidence, we can't really say. And that's where it starts to get tricky. It's representation of evidence.
Do we have a reason why cremation would start? And do we see evidence of that happening before the Bronze Age? Or
yes, most definitely.
Does it just start?
No, we see little bits of it in the Middle Stone Age, in the Mesolithic, and then it continues in places in the Neolithic, and it reappears and disappears and reappears again. And I guess the shift, where we could perhaps start to put some more defined religious changes in with hunter-gatherer groups and societies, there appears to be reasonably strong evidence that they perhaps have a whole variety of deities and spirits that are perhaps come into contact via a conduit, perhaps a shaman figure of some kind, but that shaman might be someone who represents the sky or the earth, or they might be a bit of a multi-purpose shaman, if you like. But who was that person in society? Perhaps a bit like the Bad Durenberg burial from Germany. They were someone who was afflicted from birth with spasms that would have been seen as quite odd, perhaps, in prehistoric society, but were they perhaps touched by the otherworldly forces, because every so often they had a bit of a spasm that meant they perhaps saw things that they perhaps interpreted as the other world. Who knows? But they were certainly given a huge amount of wealth in their burial, that much more wealth that you perhaps see, and that crossed gender barriers for this young lady who was buried with a child. She was given a huge amount of stone tools and lovely polished axes, as well as a whole selection of religious objects. And particularly for her, what's been interpreted as a headdress, you'll see, again, referencing for Heilung, for the headdress that's worn for much of their performances on stage. That's where that headdress comes from, as well as a lot of other shamanic figures from other cultures. But concealing the eyes, breaking that connection of eyesight, as I mentioned earlier, it plays into that shamanic role. And then further forward, with the arrival of agriculturalists and farmers in the Neolithic, they shift and seem to have more of an ancestral worship, the remains of the dead that they put in tombs and then bring out again for religious ceremonies. And we see that around the world as well. And then in the Bronze Age, they shift again and appear to worship the sun and things that are bright and hot and orange, like bronze and gold and amber, that seem to be their connection to otherworldly forces.
Were they all sort of nomadic traveling groups, or did some of them settle and stay? My thought was in terms of going back to the cremation, could it be that cremation was popular because as a traveling group you could kind of take them with you, rather than if you were to bury somebody like a loved one somewhere. If you're traveling people, then you're not going to maybe get back to see them or visit the place. If you can take it with you, then maybe that would be a reason for cremation. Or is there no correlation there?
Again, I guess there's no perfect fixed answer for everything. Hunter-gatherers for nomadic people generally have a seasonal cycle. They will return to certain places at certain times of year because they can collect resources there, they can intercept animals, or they can do something else, perhaps meet with other groups. Often you'll have religious sites or spaces at various stages in that route. And I guess a good example in Britain is the Red Lady of Paviland from the Gower, which is an Upper Paleolithic man dating to the earlier part of the Upper Paleolithic, just inside 40,000 years ago, that was almost certainly part of an expeditionary group, possibly following herd animals like reindeer into the real outpost of Europe to southern Wales, that would have been part of that northern frontier. The thick ice sheets would have been within sight from where the cave was. That was the absolute frontier of the world. But this person died and they were buried in the cave. But was that part of a ritual center? Almost certainly not. They were occasional travelers here, but they had to do something with the dead. So they carefully placed the remains in a grave, and then the group moved on. Humans are heavy to whether they're alive or dead. Was cremation something that offered them an opportunity to take the remains of that person with them? Almost definitely. Did people do that? It's hard to say, because at some point those remains have either been scattered and leave nothing, or they've been put in some kind of container, or even just as the ashes and put in the ground. Does that mean that they traveled around with the group, or they were cremated and popped straight in the ground? Who's to know? That's where it gets quite difficult.
Perfect. Okay, we'll wrap up in a second. I want to ask you one last thing, I guess. So I really enjoy going around. So I'm from Yorkshire, going around mostly Yorkshire, but looking at different monoliths that we have up here, things like the Rudstone monolith, and we have like the Devil's Arrows up in Thornborough, and also a Boroughbridge. But then there's also this Thornborough Henge, which is a huge site. Which let's split this in two. Things like monoliths, like the Rudstone monolith. Do we have like an idea of why that will be done? Is it possible to even say? The look on your face is probably like, this is one of those what is art questions, but yeah, is it possible to give a reason as to why this huge monolith? Because it seems like it was dragged for tens of miles, brought here, erected. It's really not small. It's no mean feat. It clearly has some value to it. But is there a possibility to ever say why, or even to theorize?
I mean, the Rudstone monolith is vast. Naturally, I was able to see it earlier in the year for the first time. And yeah, gosh, you stand at the base of it and you look up and think, oh, that's a big thing. Why did people move that? And actually, it's in view of many other ritual monuments in the area that you can look down straight on the stone. Some of them came after the stone was erected. Perhaps some of them came before. But I suppose being a part of many long-term projects, but sometimes moving a stone, either as part of a documentary or some other project, or building something like the Bronze Age boats recently built in Northamptonshire. I guess trying to strip away the outside layers of what it is we're doing to the actual nuts and bolts of the process is that the bringing together of people and the fun and interaction that you have along the way is as, if not more important than the finished product and the actual finished act of putting up a whacking great stone. Putting together a big project like moving a big stone and putting it upright brings together people from a whole landscape that offers opportunity for interaction, for trade, for ideas and stories to be shared that people can celebrate. That we know they certainly were doing very often in the Neolithic. People were celebrating, having feasts and rituals that might have the focus of moving a big stone and putting it up, rather than having these rituals and ceremonies because they have finished putting up a stone. The act is perhaps more important than the finished monument, as it were. But that's just an idea, a theory, but it certainly seems to be based on both a bit of ethnographic and archaeological understanding along the way. But it might be a mix of the two, that once it's up, it offers that focal point for further rituals, but the process of getting it there is equally important because you have to bring people together. And there's nothing quite like a party to get people together. And when you have a brewing and beer in the Neolithic, as we've got this evening, and this is Neolithic technology from the end of the Stone Age, there's nothing quite like bringing people together for some kind of enjoyment and a party. And moving a big stone, why not?
Why not? Why not? Okay, let's wrap up. The last one I want to ask: what do you think is, or what would you say is a misconception that you'd like to clear up from prehistory? Something that people automatically go to and just go, normal people like me say, like with Neanderthals, that they're just, brutes. Is there anything that just really jumps out that you're like, I wish people would stop thinking this?
Well, I guess we've sort of already tackled the Neanderthal one of them being brutish, so I won't cop out and say, "Oh, well, that one we talked about earlier."
I appreciate that.
I guess the idea that people were not, just we'll get a bit more content we'll wring out of him. So I guess a misconception, another one, that the idea that people were not very well connected to the wider world around them. So we talked about that glass bead from earlier from Must Farm. It was very much in the newspapers and media about this amazing thing, but actually we kind of already knew that people were well connected to the wider world around them. For those heroes like Odysseus or Achilles, they were using bronze swords and spears that may have had tin that came all the way from Cornwall. And that took trade routes and agreements and connections to get it there.
James, I could sit and speak to you all night about this. I have so many different questions just popping up. But let's wrap this up, and hopefully we can talk again in the not too distant future, and then speak about what got you into this and your work, because you make some stunning pieces. It just what you do is it's a whole episode in itself. We haven't even touched on what experimental archaeology is and how that can help us unlock the past. So there is so much to talk about. Where can people find you, your Instagram, your work, and I guess just follow you across the board?
Yeah, I guess that's perhaps a good sort of springboard, but perhaps for a future episode to give people some things to think about, some perhaps questions to build, is that you can find me, whether on almost all the social medias, at Ancient Craft UK, or if you just search in any of them, James Dilley, you'll almost certainly find me. But for what we do, it's a whole variety of different crafts and outreach. Making prehistory accessible, I suppose, is our sort of mantra, because as we've identified this evening, it's a very distant time period, and unpicking it all takes a lot of work. And it's that work that we do that I think actually part of your podcast, as you said in your own words, there's a very academic world of the understanding of the Iron Age and the Viking world, and there's everyone else that kind of wants to have that connection to that world. And you're one of those people who are quite rightly trying to make that connection for that time period, and we are those people who try to make that connection for the Stone Age and Bronze Age.
Last question, I promise. Do you think that puts people off that we're talking about when it comes to prehistoric? There is just, it's such a vast time period and there is so little to know. Do you think that puts people off maybe getting too interested in, they kind of overlook it because it's like, oh, it's kind of there, but it's difficult to really sink the teeth in. So let's just go look at the Romans or the Greeks or the Vikings. Whereas, or do you think maybe it brings people in because they're like, it's such a vast area, let's kind of hypothesize and have fun with it?
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head a little bit in that it is this vast time period that where do you start? How do you begin that process of trying to understand it? And you're quite right that it is something that perhaps seems very daunting, but actually what I would say is that once you start to dip your toes into the vast waters of prehistory, it pulls you in very quickly. There's so much to it, and there's so much to explore, and there's so much that, again, I sort of say the lay person, but there's so much even the lay person can add to our understanding of prehistory. Now, I mentioned that site from the begins the British timeline from 950,000 years ago. And I mentioned Boxgrove just down the road from here. For a long time, Boxgrove at 500,000 years ago was the oldest site on the British timeline. I guess for 1 million years ago, another sort of increasing the British timeline was found by a man walking his dog, a member of the public. And he found a hand axe, a stone tool, that was voted the most valuable archaeological object found by a member of the British public, above all the gold hoards and Roman coins that have ever been found by a member of the public. The most valuable was a flint tool because it increased the British timeline so vastly. So you can be a member of the public and add so much to prehistory. It is this vast story of worlds and untold stories that are just waiting to be found and told. And everyone can be a part of that. And that's why we want to make it accessible, because we all have a stake in it. We all own it and we are all from it.
I love that, because I think that so many people are interested in the Viking Age because there's just enough of it missing that people can apply it to themselves really well. So especially when it comes to the mythology, there's just enough missing where we know bits, we know kind of stuff, but you can really apply it into your own life. You can take it and make it yours, and it can become your little thing. And nobody can really tell you that you're wrong either way. And it can become your little thing. And I think that's why so many people come together, and Vikings are cool, but come together over this, because it's like, it's my little thing and nobody can really tell me I'm wrong. We don't know. So I like that with prehistory. You can kind of just take it, you can look at it and you can apply it to your own life. You can see yourself in them. But yeah, let's wrap this up and we will do a little bit extra just with people asking you some questions, and then I'll let you get on with your evening. If you want to follow me, it's Daniel_Farrand1, or the business Horns of Odin. And the podcast is Nordic Mythology Podcast across the board. It's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and obviously the Patreon.com/Nordic Mythology Podcast. If you want to hear more of this episode, the Q&A will be on there as well. And yeah, that's it. Let's wrap this up. James, thank you very much.